It's your boy, AC. What up, my friend? Welcome to another Algebra 2 video. Now looking at horizontal translations of square root functions, okay? Now, how do I know this is going to be a horizontal translation? It's moving to the left and to the right instead of vertical. Well, notice how this plus 1 is inside the square root where the x is located. This is going to affect our x-axis, right? Before in the previous video, we had something like this, plus 3. Notice how the 3 was not affecting anything inside our inputs. So this was just changing our y values. We're basically shifting it up 3. Now we're going to look at things horizontally. And since it's x plus 1, you would think then which direction will you go? Well, plus 1, you would think let's move everything. Let's move all these points. Here's your parent function. Let's take these points and let's move them to the right by 1. Okay, now we have to be careful because it turns out to not be true. And I'll show you. Let's graph this. So let's plug in the square root of -1 into the entire thing, -1 plus 1. What's the square root of -1 plus 1? Well, that's 0. The square root of 0 is 0. So -1 comma 0. So -1 comma 0 right there. Plug in 0. What's the square root of 0 plus 1? We get the square root of 1, which is 1. So 0 comma 1. What's the square root of, plug in 3. What's 3 plus 1? Well, we get the square root of 4, which is 2. So 3, it's 2. Boom. And maybe the one last one. What's the square root of 8 plus 1? Well, this is the square root of 9, which is 3. So when it's 8, it's going to be 3. And our graph is going to look something like this. Boom. Okay. Well, what do you notice happened? Well, from these blue dots to the black dots, which direction did we move? Well, we moved right to the left. Huh. By 1. And that seems so strange. It says, this says the square root of x plus 1. So you would think it would move to the right, but it turns out it moves to the left. And so we have to ask ourselves why. Why does that make sense? Well, my friends, let me tell you. Can you take the square root of negative numbers? Well, my friends, no, we cannot take the square root of negative numbers. So we ask ourselves, what is the first number that we can take the square root of? Well, it's 0, right? Which is 0. This is our starting point. So we always ask ourselves, how can I get 0 inside here? What can I plug in for x so that I get 0? So think of this. What number plus 1 gives me 0? Well, we need to plug in -1. And if you do -1 plus 1, that's 0. So, since it took -1 to get to our starting point, that means we're going to move to the left by 1, right? Because this is -1 is your starting point. Boom. And that's why everything moves to the left by 1. Okay. I don't know if that makes sense or not. So let's just take a look at here. Before we plug anything in, we have the square root of x minus 3. So ask yourself this question. What number do you need to plug into here to get 0? Because 0 is our starting point. Well, plug in 3. What's 3 minus 3? Well, we get 0, right? We needed to plug in x equals 3. Well, x equals 3, is that located, is 3 located on the right or is it located on the left? Well, 3 is located on the right. So what that means is we're taking all our points. Here, let me take these points that are visible on our graph. And we're going to move them to the right by 3. Boom. 1, 2, 3. There it is. 1, 2, 3. There it is. 1, 2, 3. There it is, right? Because it took a positive 3 to get to my starting point, which was 0. And let's go ahead and plug it in and verify this. And you'll see, hopefully, it'll start to kind of make some sense here. Plug in 3. We get 3 minus 3, which is what? The square root of 0, which is 0, our starting point. So 3 comma 0. Plug in 4. What's the square root of 4 minus 1? Well, that's the square root of 1, which is 1. So 4 comma 1. And you see it's starting to naturally fit over here. Again, because it took a positive 3 to get 0, which is our starting point. Okay. And now if you look over here, well, we can slowly begin to put everything together. So we have the square root of x plus 1 plus 2. So first let's do left or right. What number do you need to plug in here to get 0? Well, we need what number plus 1 gives you 0? Well, -1, right? We need to plug in -1 to get 0 in here. Okay, and if we do that, well, and then over here, well, what does the plus 2 mean? Well, that means we're just going to go up 2, or changing our y values 2 units up. So -1, that means we're moving to the left. So I'll write left by 1 and then up 2. So now I'll take all these points here that we have on this graph, and we're going to take them and move them to the left by 1. So left by 1 up 2. Boom. So I took this point, left 1 up 2, left 1 up 2, left 1 up 2, left 1 up 2, and we get this function here that's been translated, moving to the left by 1, up by 2. And if you want to, okay, I'm going to set you off, and you'll see that this will match. If you graph this will match what we just did. Plug in -1 for the x. Make sure to close it, because the square root symbol only stops at the 1. -1 plus 1, oops, plus 2. Okay, now let's do that. -1 plus 1, well, that's the square root of 0 plus 2. What's the square root of 0? That's 0 plus 2, which is 2. So when x is -1, my y value is +2. And you see it's matching our graph. So go ahead, plug the rest of these in, and you'll see we'll get these exact same dots, all right? So hopefully that makes sense to you. It's tricky, very tricky, but I think you'll get the hang of it once we get going. Peace.